Today's episode is with the one and only Imam Tom Facchine, who is the current research director of Islam and Society at Yaqeen Institute. Imam Tom Facchine converted to Islam in 2010. He finished his BA in political science from Baystar College in 2011 and was granted the opportunity to study at the Islamic University of Medina from 2015 to 2020, where he obtained his BA from the Faculty of Sharia. Imam Tom is currently the research director of Islam and Society at the Yaqeen Institute for Islamic Research. He's also resident scholar of Utica Masjid in Utica, New York, as well as the Imam of Hamilton College, where he does chaplaincy work. He also teaches tafsir to middle schoolers online through Legacy International Online High School. Inshallah, you guys enjoyed today's episode with one and only Imam Tom Facchine.
So Imam Tom, for the first question that we have today, what is the Shahadah and what does the Shahadah comprise of?
Bismillah, alhamdulillah, salatu salam rasulillah. The Shahada is a testimony of faith. Okay, it is the declaration of a conviction and a belief that you hold firmly that enters you into Islam. What is the Shahada made up of? It's made up of two parts. The first part is Ashhadu an la ilaha illallah. So it's a testimony about your beliefs that there is a creator, that creator is singular, unique, one, and that there's no other sort of deity beside him worthy of worship. And the second part of that Shahada flows from the first, that the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ is the slave and messenger of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. I think that it's important to note that the sequence of the Shahada is really significant because you can't, either of them are not correct without the other, but the first one sequentially comes first before for a reason. Because if you say that you believe in a creator, okay, well, that's not enough. You have to believe in a certain type of creator, or you have to have the right conception of who the creator is. And if you don't believe that the creator is merciful enough or wise enough to send you guidance, which is really what revelation is about, then you don't really have much faith at all, or at least you have a sort of false faith, or the faith in a misplaced faith. So revelation, believing in the creator's revelation, is just as important as believing in the creator himself, because to not believe in the revelation is to imply inappropriate things to the creator. And so the first has to do with affirming the creator, that he's singular, that he's unique, that he's alone, singling him out for worship. And the second has to do with a consequence of the first, that we believe in his revelation and we submit to his final revelation and the sunnah and everything that represents.
Jazakallah khair for that definition. So the Shahada, as we know, is the very first thing that any Muslim has to do to claim to be a Muslim. So why is it the most important pillar of our faith?
It's the most important pillar of our faith because this is going to decide what happens to us in the afterlife. Okay. Somebody can pray, somebody can fast, somebody can go on pilgrimage, someone can give money. But if they don't have the first pillar, if they don't have the testimony of faith, then it's all for nothing. On the flip side, somebody might take the Shahada and they might never pray. They might never fast. They might never do anything in terms of acts of worship. And yet Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala might enter them into paradise. And they have that right upon Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And there's various hadith that illustrate this, that the Shahada is kind of like a pact. Now that doesn't mean that you don't have to do anything after the Shahada. No, you do. But is it possible in some sort of circumstance or situation that the Shahada alone will save you on the day of judgment in the afterlife? Yes. There was a companion the companion of the Prophet ﷺ, who accepted Islam on the morning of the Battle of Uhud. And he woke up and kind of the army had already kind of left, and he woke up and he had this reckoning with himself, and he declared his faith. He took his Shahada, or he announced his Shahada, and he went to fight, and he was slain on the battlefield. And the Prophet ﷺ indicated that person was in paradise. He never prayed a prayer. He never fasted a Ramadan, right? Somebody in some far off part of the world, they might come into contact with Islam, they might realize it's the truth. They might make their Shahadah, announce their faith, and then they might die. Or they might live on, but they have no idea about what Islam is about or the other sorts of obligations that are upon them. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will enter them into paradise because of their faith. Everything in this deen turns on sincerity, and sincerity is synonymous with faith, real faith, authentic faith, true faith, which is why the Prophet Muhammad said, "Innama al-a'malu binniyat." Every single thing has to do with your intention, your sincerity. And so if you have that sincerity, right, we have even the hadith of the story of the person who killed 99 men, right? And then he kills 100. And then what's the suggestion to him? The suggestion to him is to change the place where you live. Go to this other place. And he dies on the road, right? En route to his new location. And the angels fight over him. Is he going to go to hellfire? Is he going to go to paradise? And he eventually, because he had made his intention, right? And he was putting that intention. It wasn't just wishful thinking. It wasn't just, cheap talk. He was doing it, right? He was leaving. He hadn't achieved anything great, but he had achieved, ironically, the greatest thing, which is to have sincerity and to make a change and to be heading in the right direction. And so that sincerity, that's going to carry you into the afterlife. We also have another sort of tale of warning, or a cautionary tale of the first three people to enter the fire. They're going to be people that on the outside, they look like the most pious people. The person who fought supposedly in the way of Allah, the person who was the scholar supposedly for the sake of Allah, and the person who gave money supposedly for the sake of Allah. And then they're going to have this sort of interrogation, and it will be revealed that the reason that they did those things was for their reputation. It wasn't for the sake of Allah. It had no sincerity. And because of their rotten intention and their rotten motives, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is going to put them in the fire. So sincerity and faith and belief, they're all part of the package. And so first things first, I always tell new converts or people interested in Islam that Islam is a long, long ladder, and it has many rungs. And the very, very first rung is the Shahadah. So if you believe, a lot of people, they get psyched out and they get intimidated by how tall the ladder is. And they can feel that, well, if I can't be at the top of the ladder, or I'm not ready to be up to start climbing right now, that I don't belong on the ladder at all. And I say no. If you belong on that last rung, the very first rung, the Shahadah, the belief, the testimony of faith, then you belong on that ladder. And you don't really necessarily have to think about anything else until the time is right.
So Imam, that part about sincerity, right? I think a lot of us, we question our sincerity sometimes, especially when it comes to acts of worship, and maybe we fall a little short. How do we truly know we're making a sincere effort, or how do we truly know that we're sincere in the sight of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala?
I mean, you can't ultimately, right? Only Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is going to tell you at the end of the day if you were sincere or not, which is scary. But that's also the point, right? The point is that you have to keep that edge. If we had certain knowledge that we were sincere or not sincere, we would either glory in a vain sort of way, where we would, just think that we're saved and we're fine and everything's fine, or we would despair, right? If we believed or knew with 100% certainty that we were not being sincere, then we would despair. And so there's this epistemological sort of shortcoming that we have, where we can't know 100% whether we're sincere or not. And that's supposed to generate a healthy anxiety and a healthy sense of urgency as to attempt to purify our intentions, or try to get as close as possible to knowing that we have a sincere intention. However, even though we can't know for certain, there are some indications and there are some things that we can do. So if you look at there's the hadith of the story of the three men in the cave. Right, three guys, they go into a cave and the boulder falls down over the mouth of the cave and they're stuck and they can't get out. And they come up with this idea. They said, okay, we're going to die unless we do something. So let's pray to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala by virtue of the most sincere deed that we ever did, right? Because you might not have an absolute sense of what's sincere, but you might have like a comparative sense or a qualitative sense. Like that thing that I did, it was more sincere than some of the other things that I did. Now, what are the features or characteristics, how we can tell, or the metrics or the factors? What would contribute to a sincere deed? It has to be against your interests, right? Against your material interests. It has to be when nobody else is watching, right? And so if you have these sort of two qualities to your deed, there's a really good chance that it was sincere. And in fact, that's the kind of deed that these three men they prayed by virtue of. They said, the one, the one said that he was serving his parents, right? And he's always served his parents before his kids. And then one night he was going to serve his parents, and they fell asleep, and his kids were whining, and they were hungry or thirsty or whatever it was. And despite sort of anybody who is a parent knows the discomfort of having your child cry or your child have a need and you not fulfilling it. It's a very, very primal thing, right? Where, your hair stands up on ends and you get goosebumps, you hear your child crying. And despite that, right, the person, they had the discipline to wait until their parents woke up. They didn't want to wake them up. They didn't want to disturb their sleep, so that they could demonstrate that sort of loyalty. And so, sure enough, they prayed according to that sort of deed that they had done. They said, if this is sincere, and that's the kind of epistemic humility, right? They didn't know for certain, but they said, like, well, if this deed was sincere, then move the boulder a little bit. And then the boulder moves a little bit. And so that's confirmation. Yes, it was sincere. It went against your interests. Nobody else was there to kind of inspire you to do this act. You didn't have any sort of ulterior motive or something that you were benefiting from it. Another of the men, he was lusting after this girl, right? He thought that this particular young lady was, absolutely whatever you want to say. And he was constantly trying to seduce her. And she kept on rebuffing him and turning him down and stuff like that, until a day came when she was financially in dire straits. And he had before even offered money to her to kind of, give herself to him. And she had refused, but now she was in such a hard situation, such a difficult situation, that she caved in and she accepted the offer. And so the man was there. He was ready to do the deed, right? And then he walked away. She said, fear Allah, and et cetera, but he had to accept it. And he did. He didn't have any sort of ulterior motive. He didn't have anything that he was benefiting from it. He recognized it was true, and he left the money with her because she was in a hard situation, and he walked away, and he didn't commit fornication with her. And so he prays, if that was sincere, then move the boulder. And so the boulder moved again, because again, it's against his interests, right? His material interests, nobody's going to know except for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and the angels. If he did it, he's, they're out of sight somewhere. And yet he had a moment of triumph. And so this is what we're talking about. If you, if you give money to somebody, there's a famous story of Abu Bakr, right? Abu Bakr radiallahu anhu. He had a relative named Mistah, and Mistah was poor. And so Abu Bakr was supporting Mistah financially. Well, then what happened was the ifk happened, right? The slander against Abu Bakr's daughter, Aisha, like basically accusing his daughter of sleeping around behind the messenger's back, alayhi salatu wasalam. Like, talk about a scandal. And so Abu Bakr decided he's going to punish Mistah by cutting off his supply lines. He's not going to give him money anymore. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala rebukes him in the Quran and says, hey, don't do this. And so Abu Bakr then, he actually had made an oath, and he had to break his oath and in order to continue funding him. Why? Because if he had retracted his financial assistance due to some sort of poor treatment, then that would have demonstrated what? That would have demonstrated that he wasn't really sincere, that he was doing it to control somebody, or he was doing it expecting some sort of payback in the dunya, right? He was doing it in order to be treated with respect, or in order to be treated in a good way. Okay, so who's going to keep giving in charity when the person spits in your face or throws it in your face, right? That's what we're talking about. That's the sincerity that we're after, that it becomes irrelevant what the recipient of the action or what anybody else is doing. They blame you for it. They invent this huge scandal, this lie or whatever. You're going to do it because it's the right thing to do, and you're relating to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and you're not relating to the dunya.
So when a person is coming to that decision of whether they want to make the Shahadah or not, whether they want to be a Muslim, what is the proper mindset that they should have going into making that decision? and also relating to the point of sincerity again, if a person does have any other things in mind while taking the Shahada, some people may want to convert for the sake of marriage or any other reason like that, and maybe their primary purpose is for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, but then they have this other secondary gain. Is that something that's allowed for them? But the main question would be, what is their mindset supposed to be going into that?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, there's no one cookie cutter option because people are all different.
Right.
But and you find extremes, right? You find two extremes.
Right.
You find some people who are kind of assume the role of gatekeepers, and they roll their eyes every time somebody converts for a marriage and stuff like that. And yet there are people who have converted for dunya reasons, right? Maybe primarily, but then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala continued to guide them, and they actually became stronger in faith than even their spouse. And this happened actually during the time of Umar radiallahu anhu, when he was the Khalifa. There was a sort of a local tribal chieftain somewhere in Sham, and when the soldiers got there, basically they're like, okay, here's your options or whatever, and you should convert to Islam if you know what's good for you. It would be better for you. And he said, tell Umar, or he didn't say it in this way, but basically the essence of it was, I'll convert if I get to be the Khilafah after Umar, right? And the local Muslims were astonished. They're like, well, that's quite bold. I don't really know how to respond to that. And so they wrote a letter back to Umar for instruction. Like, what do we tell this guy? On one hand, we want him to convert. On the second hand, the question is ridiculous. Like, it's a ridiculous demand, and it shows maybe arrogance and these other sorts of spiritual diseases. Now, Umar sends a letter back. But before the letter gets there, that chieftain actually passes away. And so it's very dramatic. And so like the soldiers, they open up the letter. It came from Umar. They're in this situation. And Umar radiallahu anhu had said, tell him he can have it. Tell him he can have the khilafah after me. Because if Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala guides him to take a shahada and guides him to Islam, then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala can continue to guide that person. Right? So too much gatekeeping is unnecessary, and it's not enough. That being said, there is another extreme, right? Like, some people have significant doubts, and other people are pressuring them to get the shahada, right? And especially with the age of social media and YouTube and stuff like that, they're recording or whatever, and they want the shahada, right? When that person, maybe they're not spiritually ready, right? There's some significant doubts that person would be better off working through. Than converting and maybe feeling this sort of imposter syndrome, or not feeling like they are 100% aligned, or even like 60% aligned with the new sort of thing that they signed up for, right? So there are two extremes, and that's why I say there's no one cookie cutter solution. It's got to be a case-by-case basis. There's some people that I've seen that were pressured into taking the shahada probably before they were ready. And they didn't really have their doubts heard meaningfully by anybody. And then there's other people that I've seen that were kind of turned away or discouraged in an unreasonable way. So I think both of those things have to be kept in mind.
Right. Okay. Is there any proper etiquette that a new Muslim should have when making the Shahada and entering into the fold of Islam? And is there anything they have to do afterwards as like an etiquette or as a sunnah or something that they should do?
Not really. Like, strictly speaking, like when it comes to the Sharia, it's like, if somebody is in the middle of the forest somewhere and they say, I believe that, God is one or whatever. And maybe, like that's a form of Shahada, right? Especially maybe somehow they heard about the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. They accept both parts. It doesn't have to be in Arabic. It doesn't have to be in a masjid. It doesn't have to have witnesses. It doesn't have to have, at the end of the day, your faith is between you and your creator, right? And how many people took their Shahada secretly, right? Or declared their faith secretly and hid it from everybody and then died. Okay, so you're going to tell me that their Shahada counts for nothing, or their faith counts for nothing just because they didn't get up in front of people and put it on YouTube? That's ridiculous, right? That being said, we're not just going after what's bare minimum permissible, right? So there are situations where doing it in front of other people is very important. There's other situations where connecting them, you talk about afterwards, follow-up and things like that, I'm sure we'll get to that soon, is extremely important. Some people, they really, really need a switch. They've had a really rough life up until the point at which they're about to convert. And so they need some sort of clean break. A lot of people change their names, and obviously that's not for everybody. I didn't change my name, but some people, they change their names because they're trying to symbolize turning over a new leaf, and they're trying to really, sort of marshal that motivation in order to live a very, very different life, which is a beautiful thing. Nobody should be stopped from that. And then and taking your shahada in front of a bunch of people in a community can be part of that, right? Like that has that sort of accountability. So right, we know you, and you know everybody else, and now it's like this is your family, and now we're going to be checking up on you, and now we're going to like offer assistance to you, being known, right? Like there's a certain type of profile where that's actually really important. There's another type of profile that's the opposite. They might be just like, thinking about things by themselves in their room, in their house or whatever. And coming to the masjid and being sort of like a public part of the Muslim community is the last part of their Islam. And that's fine too. And that's fine too, right? Like I said, converts are not a monolith. It's not a cookie cutter solution. But I think that the important thing, we're talking about etiquettes. It's not necessarily like sunnah or etiquettes in the formal sense of like, these are what the fuqaha say, but but in an informal, the maqsad of having etiquette, what's going to be the most facilitous, right, to this person's spiritual growth is that somebody who's like a spiritual buddy or like a companion that's hopefully has some sort of connection with a scholar or an imam or something like that to get advice. That person asked me this question today, how should I handle it? Here's where they're at, here are their doubts, what should I say to them? They're not sure if they're ready to come to the masjid or whatever. Having that connection and that support person is pretty important for a whole lot of people, the majority, I would say. And then just and I'm not trying to get ahead of ourselves here, but support and follow up. A lot of people, unfortunately, I think I see two vectors of influence on dawah to non-Muslims, and one of them comes from sort of Christian missionary work and evangelism, and then the other one comes from social media. And both of these vectors of influence, I think, have put too much emphasis on the moment of conversion and sort of the emotional story of, well, here's who I was, and now I've converted or whatever. And as is well known to anybody in the Dawah scene, what is everybody forgetting? That's what happens after. Who picks up the pieces when the person gets kicked out of their home? Who helps, give them a ride to work, or helps get them another job when they lose their job? The after support is probably the most essential part. That is also the least emphasized part.
Right. And Imam, if you could just speak a little bit about your own personal insight, could you describe what it was like when you took your Shahada?
Yeah, so I was one of those people who was very much like researching it off by myself, and kind of like the community aspect was the last aspect for me. That was kind of my personality towards it. Actually, it was funny. I mean, I started praying and fasting Ramadan before I took my Shahada. And I completed the Ramadan before I took my Shahada. I didn't even know I had to take the Shahada. And then somebody, I sort of became exposed to Islam in college, and I had this one professor who was a Muslim that were kind of like, the source of a lot of early sort of education. But then I graduated and I went back and I was, living with my parents and working in restaurants and just sort of, being a normal person. I hadn't yet decided to go to a masjid. But I was a Muslim. I was praying and I was doing my stuff. And then I get a phone call one day, and this professor, they were like, "Hey, I'm passing through your area. I just wanted to check. Like, are you like actually Muslim now? Like you pray, you fast?" And I was like, "Well, I pray and I fast, yeah." And they're like, "Well, you got to take your Shahada." I'm like, "Oh, okay." And that happened to be in the city of Philadelphia, where the professor was passing through, and so I just happened to come to the West Philadelphia, I think 44th and Walnut. It was just, whatever masjid happened to be there. I had no relationship to it at all. I'm from New Jersey, so it's like I'd never been there before. And I went in there. They took me down to the basement. One guy who I can't even remember his name, said a couple things and had me repeat the Shahada. No exchange of numbers or anything. Literally never saw the guy again in my life. No follow-up, no, incorporation of the community. Absolutely nothing. Absolutely nothing. So, it is what it is. Alhamdulillah, Allah had a plan, and I'm grateful for how things went. But yeah, like I think it was sort of indicative of some of the shortcomings. Here's another shortcoming that happened. I was already married at the time. Alhamdulillah, my wife accepted Islam shortly thereafter. But we were married, and we were there together. And so she's kind of upstairs, and I'm like taking them to the dingy basement or whatever to take my Shahada. And I find out that when I come back up, right, somebody had asked, one of the sisters, who was also a convert, had told her that if she doesn't convert, like right then and there, that every touch between us is haram. And this made it really difficult. This like really set back sort of all the progress that I had been making, with my wife, out of complete ignorance and with no questions about like, the religious beliefs of I don't know. Well, I guess she was assuming that my wife was like an atheist or a polytheist or something like this. Like she just had no clue and didn't take the time to find out. So, you really, really do have to move slow with converts, and you really do have to be understanding and understand that things take time. And be willing to kind of play the long game and the lesser of two evils, and to slowly, I can't tell you how many converts that have reached out to me and said that, well, they're not praying because they're not ready to pray 5 times a day. I'm like, well, start with 1 a day. I'm like, really? I can do that? I'm like, I mean, that's better than 0 times a day, right?
Right.
And so they have a kind of like an all or nothing attitude. And there's a lot of sort of ignorance. Internet has made it worse. You go Google search, you get 20 different opinions and a lot of bluster and stuff like that. So everybody just needs to be real chill, and again, support. I think that the thing that converts, that my experience and other people's experience illustrates, is that converts need your support more than they need your book recommendations, more than they need your arguments, right? And necessarily, they really just need a lot of social support and encouragement.
Right. So when you took your Shahada, or before you took your Shahada, you mentioned that you were already fasting, you were already doing some acts of worship beforehand. Why is it so important to actually verbally utter the Shahada? Why can't we just simply, have this belief in our heart, or even do the acts of worship? Why is it so important to actually say the phrase?
Yeah. I mean, it's I think it's symbolic more than anything, right? Strictly speaking, it's not a requirement. If you believe in it, right, it's in your heart. Like somebody who can't speak, somebody who's mute, right? Okay, you tell me they can't become a Muslim because they can't say the Shahada? No, of course that's ridiculous, right? So, obviously Allah knows what's in your heart. But again, making the formality or formalizing it gives accountability, right? So now you have to live up to your word, right? You said that you believe in this. Now you're accountable to what you just said, as opposed to sort of, there's a situation of like plausible deniability if you never said it, or you didn't say it in front of anybody else. So, there's wisdom behind these things. They're not necessarily absolute. They're not necessarily like strict in the strictest sense of the word, like requirements, but there is wisdom behind it.
Right. And do you have any advice for the person who is thinking about becoming Muslim, but just hasn't taken that step yet?
Yeah, definitely. I think the 2 things that I mentioned earlier, again, the ladder metaphor, I use it all the time. It's like Islam is a long ladder. If you find yourself, you think that you belong on the very, very bottom rung, then you belong on the ladder. Don't let anybody tell you that you don't. You're not wearing hijab, you're not praying, you're not fasting. Allah can do amazing things. Don't worry about it right now. Worry about, do you believe in the Shahada? You believe that a creator exists? Do you believe that he's perfect? Do you believe that there's nothing else that deserves to be worshipped except for him? Do you believe that there is such a thing as prophecy, that there is such a thing as revelation? Do you believe that the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ is the final messenger who's been given a preserved revelation? If you believe in those things, then you belong on the ladder. That's as simple as it is, right? And everything else can come later, right? You might find right away that you're ready to start climbing that ladder and go higher. You might find that it might take you some time. You might have other things going on. Maybe you're an addict. Maybe you've got a hard relationship that you're involved in. Maybe you're dependent on your parents, right? There's other things that are going on in converts' lives. But if you belong on that bottom ladder, then there's no excuse to not be on the ladder. Go get on the ladder and worry about climbing later. And the other thing I think I would say is that, don't fall into the group think. Don't fall into the just nodding along. Like if you have serious doubts, then it's on you to figure it out. It's on you to ask the questions, and you can't have this unrealistic expectation where, well, I met one imam and he kind of like had a bad reaction, or he didn't answer my doubts or whatever, and so Islam's false. No, I mean, you keep asking people, right? You keep asking. And we have a paradigm here in the story of Salman, right? The Salman Farsi, who went from one teacher to another teacher to another teacher, and then eventually ended up in Medina, right? But, he was in the search of truth, right? He was looking for truth, and he just kept on moving. It's like even when I became a Muslim, I still had questions. Not everything was resolved, but I knew that enough of it was resolved, and I had enough conviction that I knew I belonged on the ladder. Right. And then those other sort of doubts and questions I had, I just kept in my back pocket, and I just kept on moving. Right. And then it's like when I was able to go to Medina and study in Medina, and even sometimes in Medina, I would ask sheikhs questions, and sometimes they would hit it on the head, absolutely nail it. Then other times it's like, nah, he doesn't really get what I'm trying to ask. And I didn't, have an immature reaction and just say, oh, these are just whatever, phonies. No, I put it in my back pocket and I kept moving. I said, one day I'm going to keep asking this question, and one day I hope I'm going to find a satisfactory answer. And wallahi, every single question I've had like that, it's been like that. Eventually, if I keep on asking, if I keep on going to different people, I eventually get a satisfying answer. But you have to take responsibility for it. What happens sometimes is that when converts feel a pressure to not rock the boat or to just nod along or whatever, and their heart's not really convinced, then they get in a situation where they feel like a fake. They've got this kind of double life going on, where on the outside, you become a hijabi Instagram influencer or whatever, and you really got significant doubts in your heart about, about this, that, and the third. Well, that's a recipe for disaster. If you have doubts, you got to confront them with some courage and take the steps to actually get them settled, because no one's going to do it if you don't.
Right. So we all know that the Shahada has two parts, like you just said, Imam, about how the first part, it's about testifying belief in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, no other being worthy of worship except for him. And the second part is testifying the prophecy of Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. How can we connect with that second part? Because I know even like as born Muslims, we struggle to have that connection with our prophet. Maybe it's because his life was 1400 years ago. Maybe it's because sometimes we see that stories from this era are a bit unrelatable. For whatever reason, right? I think this is a huge problem that I myself and like a lot of people around me struggle with. So what tangible advice could you give us to connect more with that second part and to truly build love for our Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam?
Yeah, I mean, as I kind of touched on earlier, I think it flows from a robust understanding of the first part, right? So you have to understand how much Allah loves you, and you have to understand how wise Allah is, right? If I go, one of the many things that I do, I teach middle schoolers, okay? Now, where middle schoolers are when it comes to their intellectual development, you have to be, pedagogically appropriate with them, right?
Right.
You're not going to take a sixth grader and use very, very abstract theoretical language. You got to break it down, stories, examples, these sorts of things. Okay, so that's, when you look at human beings, why is it that folk tales, right, are so ubiquitous? And legends and these sorts of things are just like every single culture has them. And they're told around the fire for centuries or millennia, right? And these stories get passed on because human beings are made to be taught that way, right? They're made to be taught through stories and through personal narratives and through individual examples, embodiment. So it's not abstract, it's not theoretical. The move to sort of abstract knowledge is a fairly recent development, and it's fine, right? It's okay, but it's a little bit elitist in the sense that what has mass appeal and much more sticking power is a role model, right? Seeing and doing. And that's just the facts. I think everybody in any sort of field or job or whatever can relate to that. And so when you understand how much care and wisdom Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala put into our guidance, right? If he wanted to, he could have just given us the Quran by itself, right? He could have just given us everything, just like the Torah, but subtract Musa, right? He could have just given us the tablets and like, here, you guys, here's the instruction manual. You buy something on Amazon, right? A coffee maker or whatever. Here's the instruction manual. You figure it out. But no, you know, what's the benefit of today? You don't just have the instruction manual. You can go on YouTube, right? You can go on YouTube and see someone doing it, right? That's for education. So that's what the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ is. He is, you know, the person who he's been sent for a reason. He's been sent to show you what it looks like to put it all together. Because if, you know, Quran is 604 pages, and the hadith, you know, how many thousands of hadith are there, right? Just like from a mathematical point of view, I can pick one thing out of one page. Maybe I remember something on page 2 and I forgot something on page 600, right? How do I know that I'm putting it all together in the right way? Well, that's the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ. Like he brought it all together in his person, in his character, in his decision making, right? But why did he do this and not do this other thing, right? So having that, sort of realizing the role that he serves in our lives and the sort of like anchor, right? And this aspirational model. A lot of Muslims, they want to know like why we get so up in arms when like the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ is mocked or when he is drawn in sort of like a satirical way. And the best response I've seen to that is this, because that's the role model that every single one of us is trying to become, right? Every single Muslim in the world is trying to comport, we're trying to conform, right? To that example. Like we're trying to change our bodies, our habits, our mindset, you know, everything, so that we're more like him. Okay. And so when you mock that or you make fun of that, you're making fun of us, right? You're making fun of not just the pieces of him that, you know, we are kind of like already sort of embodying, but also what we want to embody in the future. Right? So that's why it's super important, because we see that as a model, we keep it in front of our eyes and we say, it's like, okay, this is how I want to be. Once you get there, you know, that hopefully is going to provide the motivation now to understand, okay, now you have to get into the details of how he was and how he reacted and why he reacted this way or that way and the third. So it's all kind of, you know, it's sequential. There's some things that have to be taken care of first before you kind of feel that motivation to want to learn more about him. So that's
right. So Imam, Jazakallah khair for being on our episode. We're just going to close in with a few rapid fire questions. If that's okay with you. So you can answer this however long you want, or even with just one sentence. The first one is, what is one act of worship that you suggest people implement into their lives?
Act of worship that people should implement into their lives is doing things when nobody is watching. Whether that's a prayer, just like 2 rak'ah, or some charity, right? Or whatever it is, make sure that just have something that absolutely nobody else knows about.
Okay. What is one book that you'd recommend? I know you mentioned that people just give book recommendations, but if you could just recommend one book.
It's cool because, you know, we're actually for Yaqeen Institute, we're working on a book for non-Muslims and another one for converts. But and one thing that we keep on coming back to is one of the most powerful books that exists in the English language is A Road to Mecca by Muhammad Asad. So one of the best narratives. You know, the level of English is so high. Like he's such a, and not in an abstract, obtuse, hard to understand way. No, it's like, it's beautiful. It's like poetry in motion. And his personal narrative, like the people he met along the way, it's just hard to believe, you know, and his reflections on how Islam sort of interacts and responds to and solves some of the issues of the modern time period that we live in. It's a really, really powerful book. So Muhammad Asad, A Road to Mecca.
Okay. And the phrasing of this could be a bit better, but what is your favorite surah? And if that's poor phrasing, then what is a surah that you connect to, that you see yourself coming back to time and time again?
I've got several. I mean, it's hard to pick just one. I think
Right.
you know,
Yeah.
I'm very much drawn to Surah Al-Ma'idah. It's very strong against the people of the book, and also, you know, there's some very interesting linguistic sort of miracles in it. The structure of Baqarah is really, really intriguing, how it circles back. Like Allah, you know, yeah, there's really significant things going on in the first half of Surah Al-Baqarah where he's talking about Bani Israel, and he circles back to give him a burn in the end, right? Because he's talking about all these sorts of acts of infidelity and arrogance that Bani Israel has committed. And one of them, among many, is their sort of ingratitude to the 12 streams that issue forth from rocks, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then Allah keeps going, he keeps going, he keeps going. And then at the end, when he's closing out that part, he says, but their hearts became hard as rocks. No, actually harder than that, because lo, look, behold, there are rocks from which rivers gush forth. So it's like, whoa, you know, he circled back and referenced something from before. There's also some interesting things in Surah Al-Baqarah where he, subhanahu wa ta'ala, anticipates what the reader is going to think or suspect. So, you know, the 60-second ayah, the famous one, where it's like, yeah, the people who believe in Allah and the Christians and the Jews, etc., whoever believes and does righteous deeds, you know, they're going to be okay. The context is often subtracted from that verse. It's in the middle of listing this whole rap sheet of Bani Israel, right? And so it's as if the reader is thinking, dang, all of them? Like they were that bad, like every single one? And then it's as if Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, anticipating that, is saying, nope, not all of them, not all of them, you know, and then continues to rail against their sort of shortcomings. I think Surah Al-An'am is really powerful for the really fine detail it gets into when it comes to Aqidah, and what it means to worship Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala sincerely. Surah Al-Isra is beautiful. I love Surah Al-Isra. Surah Al-Furqan is amazing. That's one I come back to a lot. Surah Al-Rahman, Surah Al-Najm, Surah Al-Waqi'ah, Al-Hujurat. These are the ones that I come back to the most. The end of Surah Al-Zumar, of course, the end of Surah Taha. Yeah. So, you know, they're popular responses, I'm sure, but like, those are sort of my favorite parts of the Quran.
Right. And the very last question. So Relay is an organization seeking to empower converts, born Muslims, and the community as a whole through essential Islamic resources and content. We want to echo the saying of the Prophet Muhammad SAW, convey from me even a single verse. Relay is also inspired by the concept of a relay race. So that's kind of where we got our name, the image of a relay race, a team working together to complete a difficult task. So Imam Tom, which Islamic figures from history would you want to have on your relay race team?
I'm going to limit myself to people who are alive right now. Because just like my Dawah dream team, right?
Yeah, pretty much.
Right? So, I mean, let's see, who would be on my Dawah dream team? Definitely Abu Sumayya LeBron, Wesley LeBron would be there, 100%. He is one of the realest sheikhs out there. He does stuff for Mass Rebirth Reconnect. If nobody knows that in the city, definitely check him out. Imam Daniel Hernandez in Allentown, he would be on my Dawah dream team. Sheikh Muhammad Shanawi, he would also be there. Let's see. Mufti Munir, I haven't talked with Mufti for a long time, but he would be there. Omar Suleiman, Sheikh Omar Suleiman would be there. I don't know anybody who covers the pastoral element of Dawah better than he does. Me, myself, like I like the theory, I like the ideas, I like the discourse, but that's only one side, and we're all on the same team at the end of the day. And something that, you know, Sheikh Omar has down to just an art is the pastoral side, understanding how people are feeling, tapping into to what motivates them and encouraging them and helping them along. It's a rare gift, to be honest. Boy, I don't want anyone to feel excluded, but those are the first people that come to mind, and they're all, you know, North American, you know, mostly East Coast folks, because that's my experience. That's who I know personally. But that would definitely be. And of course, I gotta throw in Sheikh Tahir Wyatt in there too. Yeah, he would be. Yeah, that would be a dream team for me.
Mashallah, that's a really strong team, mashallah. Jazakallah khair, Imam, for your time today. We really appreciate you taking time out of your day. And I'm sure many of our audience would benefit from this episode, inshallah.
Barakallahu feek, I really appreciate it. May Allah bless you in your work.